Bonjour tout le monde. The press conference with Annamie Paul will now begin. La conférence de presse avec la chef du Parti vert Annamie Paul va maintenant commencer.
Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for being with us today. There's no question that the first thing I need to begin with today is our third wave and the devastating impact that the third wave is having on many parts of the country. As someone who lives in Ontario, I have a firsthand view of this. It's the reason that I'm not in Ottawa today for the budget. There were unfortunately not any accommodations made to ensure that we could participate safely in a lockup. And so I am here doing what our public health officials have advised everyone to do, which is to stay home as much as possible unless absolutely necessary. The third wave is continuing unabated. And we know that this is a time that we need to pull together nationally, that a national pandemic, a national crisis requires a national response and a national strategy. It is something that we have been calling for since November. It is something where the calls have increased during this third wave, most recently on Friday, when the Canadian Medical Association called for a nationally coordinated response. And so this is something that where we were encouraged to see some activity this weekend by the federal government and by the Prime Minister reaching out to provinces. I would say that it is quite clear at this point that our effectiveness in terms of our COVID response strategy is being impeded and compromised by political division. There is simply no good reason that at this late stage and with the situation so grave in so many provinces, why we have not had a direct conversation between the premiers in the hardest hit provinces and our Prime Minister. And so I believe that we have to acknowledge that fact and say that if we are going to mobilize the health and human resources that are needed as quickly as possible, that the politicians need to step back and the health officials and health experts need to take the lead. I don't believe that at this stage we are quite at the point of needing to invoke the Emergencies Act, because what I do see is that people across Canada are willing to work together, that they are generous, that they do want to support other people in Canada in provinces that have been particularly hard hit if given the opportunity. So I believe that if we have the politicians and the political rhetoric taking a backseat, and we have the health officials, the nurses, the doctors, our epidemiologists, our infectious disease specialists taking the front seat, then we are likely to see the kind of coordinated response that those closest to this pandemic and to the toll that it is taking across Canada can provide. In terms of today's budget, this is a budget that is happening in the context of a devastating third wave that we cannot yet see the end of. And so we have to keep in mind that the budget and the government of Canada and all members of Parliament must be focused on delivering the urgent help that people in Canada need right now. And in terms of that, the things that are needed that have yet to be supplied include a national moratorium on evictions, a new national residential tenant support benefit, which would address the crisis of evictions, particularly of low-income people, many of them essential workers due to income loss during the pandemic. We need to see a reinstatement of the Canada Emergency Student Benefit, topped up to $2,000 per month, in recognition that the summer has arrived for students. It arrives in May, and they face a dismal job market and unusually high unemployment. We also want to see the extension of the COVID emergency benefits to the end of the year. The uncertainty of these very short extensions of the benefit make it very hard for people to plan, very hard for people to have the stress of not knowing where the supports are going to come from it's very hard for that to be lifted. And so knowing that that benefit is in place until the end of the year would be important. And then finally, in terms of the urgent things that are needed right now, decriminalization and creating a safe supply is essential. We are in a record-breaking year for opioid-related deaths. Out in BC, it was reported last week that the numbers have increased to 5 per day. And we know that what we are doing now is not enough and that we are paying for the inaction in lives lost. Now, I want to be very frank and to say that the Green Party does not have a lot of confidence. I do not have a lot of confidence that this session of Parliament is going to last long enough for whatever the plans and items are in the budget beyond these most urgent, immediate needs. The signaling is very clear that a general election is imminent. There is a lot of pre-election posturing going on, which is discouraging, but which suggests that the time to actually implement any budget items may be very short. That being said, we will never abandon hope that all political parties can come together in the way that people in Canada expect them to achieve historic gains for Canadians, to work across party lines, to keep this session of Parliament going until we achieve and deliver the most important policies that we know we should have in place for people in Canada. I truly believe that there is common ground if we look for it, if we prioritize people, and that if we do commit ourselves to that in the 2+ years that are left in this session of Parliament, we really could do extraordinary things. And many extraordinary things have been accomplished by minority parliaments in the past. These things include a guaranteed livable income, long-term care reform, new universal programs, including childcare, pharmacare, and post-secondary education, a commitment to a 60% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 levels by 2030, enhanced investments related to a green recovery to accelerate our progress toward a net zero economy, major investments in the renewable electricity sector, a national mental health strategy, and of course, true reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So this is ambitious, but it is possible. It is possible if we work together. These are things that I will work with any party to achieve, that our caucus will work with any party to achieve. And given the time that we have left, these things are achievable if we choose to seek the common ground. Alors, dans le budget d'aujourd'hui, il faut reconnaître que c'est un budget qui se passe dans le contexte du 3e vague de la pandémie. C'est un moment absolument pour le gouvernement du Canada, mais aussi tous les membres, tous les députés du Parlement, d'être complètement concentrés sur les besoins urgents des personnes au Canada. Dans ce contexte, c'est très important de voir aujourd'hui que la prestation pour les locataires soit créée en face d'une crise de logement abordable et les personnes qui sont en risque de perdre leur logement. Il faut aussi assurer que la prestation d'urgence pour les étudiants soit en place pour l'été de 2021 et augmenter à 2 000 $ par mois, exactement comme la prestation d'urgence qui existe pour les autres peuples au Canada. On veut aussi voir une extension des prestations jusqu'au fin de l'année, exactement parce que c'est très difficile de planifier, c'est très difficile de sortir d'en-dessus de la stress si on continue rajouter 1 mois, 2 mois, 3 mois à ces prestations. Il faut aussi vraiment attaquer finalement et terminer le taux record des morts associés aux opioïdes et aux empoisonnements toxiques causés par les drogues, par la décriminalisation et la création d'un accès sûr à un approvisionnement sûr aussi. Malheureusement, à mon avis, nous sommes en train de voir un budget qui est moins un budget et plus qu'un programme électoral pour les élections de 2021, parce qu'on voit que la coopération nécessaire pour continuer dans cette session de Parlement continue à se dégrader. Mais le Parti vert ne perd pas l'espoir. Nous avons l'espoir que si les autres partis décident de le faire avec nous, nous pouvons assurer que cette session de Parlement continue jusqu'au point qu'on atteint des buts importants dans l'intérêt des peuples ici au Canada. Il y a beaucoup de choses en commun si on les cherche. Et si on veut être ambitieux, ce serait très bien de voir aujourd'hui dans le budget et de travailler avec les autres partis vers une revenu minimum garanti, une grande réforme de notre système de soins de longue durée, la création des nouveaux systèmes universels comme les systèmes pour la garderie, pour l'assurance médicaments, pour l'éducation postsecondaire, pour la réduction des gaz à effet de serre à 60% des niveaux de 2005 dans l'année 2030, et aussi les investissements nécessaires pour soutenir une relance verte aussi. Une approche, une stratégie nationale pour la santé mentale et finalement, et le plus important, une vraie réconciliation avec les peuples autochtones. Alors, tout ça est possible si on décide de travailler ensemble, si on décide de concentrer sur la possibilité d'un avenir plus soutenable, une économie plus forte et un pays où tout le monde a la possibilité de vivre en dignité. J'espère de voir ça dans le budget. Aujourd'hui, le Parti vert est là pour travailler en collaboration avec chaque parti et chaque député qui veut le faire dans la vie de cette session de Parlement. Merci.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. We will now begin with questions. One question, one follow-up. Nous allons commencer avec des questions. Une question, un suivi. Please use the raised hand feature if you wish to ask a question. Veuillez utiliser la fonction de lever la main si vous voulez poser une question. I did get a request from David Thurton. So first, please go ahead, David. Allez-y, David.
Hi, Madam Paul. It's very good to hear from you and to see you today. The first question I just want to ask you is, you're not in favor of invoking the Emergency Measures Act. Can you just explain why you're not in favor of that, why you're opposed to the NDP making that call today?
I believe that, and again, just, you know, David, did you hear what I said before about the oppositional talk? We're really not seeking to put ourselves in opposition to anything. What we're trying to do is to propose something that we think is a more workable, useful, productive solution. And so in our case, what we have called for since November is a rapid response task force to coordinate every single aspect of the pandemic that would have and still would benefit from that coordinated response. And we heard that last week from the Canadian Medical Association. We've heard that from many health associations, many health experts for quite some time now, particularly in this third wave, that there are some things that just need to be coordinated at the national level that require the deployment, the reallocation of resources from one place to another, and that needs to be facilitated. And so it's encouraging to see that the Prime Minister reached out to some of his counterparts this weekend. But what we need to see is something more enhanced than that, and clearly something that is going to have to be led by health officials and health experts, exactly because of the kind of political divisions that unfortunately we see in our country right now. And so we've seen the generosity all across the country. We have seen people say directly and through their elected officials, they want to help, they want to support each other. And so I would much rather focus on a response that taps into that generosity rather than a response that requires the imposing of strict measures that presume that that the response between provinces and between Canadians is not going to be sufficient. I will not rule it out until we are certain that that the help is getting where it's needed. But I think that there are certain less, excuse me, less drastic steps that we can take before that will yield the results that we need if we do it the right way.
Do you have a follow-up, David?
Yeah. And so I guess just to kind of sum up, and I kind of joined the Zoom call late, just succinctly, just tell us maybe what are the 3 top things the Greens want to see, need to see in today's budget?
Well, I don't know when you joined, but one of the things that I said that I observed is that given the current trajectory of this parliament, given the escalating rhetoric and the loss of the early pandemic solidarity, it doesn't seem like any of the long-term promises contained in this budget are going to be fulfilled, because we're going to be in an election before those have a chance to happen. And so given that, and given the very immediate needs that people in Canada have, that some people in Canada have that still haven't been met, we're focused very much on the urgent needs, the things that we want to see in the budget and we want to see implemented as soon as possible. That includes a national moratorium on evictions. We know that some jurisdictions have implemented their own temporary ones in this third wave, but we want something along the lines of what they've done in the United States and what we've done at other times of crisis in Canada. We want to see a residential tenant support benefit, because we have seen the beginnings of a massive wave of evictions across the country led by a loss of income during the pandemic. We also want to see students protected, young people protected. We have to recognize that the jobs are not yet there for them, and that their summers have begun now and they need support now. So we want a return of the Canada Emergency Student Benefit. And then we will continue to talk about the need for decriminalization and a safe supply. It was touched upon in the fall economic statement, but the government didn't go as far as they needed to, and we're paying the price every day with lives lost. So those are the urgent things that we want to see in the budget. And then, as I said, we have ambitions for what we could do with a couple of years. We would love to have those couple of years to really get down to the business of representing people in Canada and bringing in some of those historic social programs. But that is not the way this parliament is trending, unfortunately.
Thank you, David. We'll now go to Travis from Global News. Travis, go ahead, please. 1 question, 1 follow-up.
Ms. Paul, thank you for taking my questions today. I kind of want to shift gears to focus on Ontario and the situation here. Obviously, it's not that good. There are growing calls for the Premier of Ontario to step aside and resign because of the crisis that we are facing in this province right now. The Ontario Liberal leader has called for it. The NDP leader has called for it. I'm just wondering what your take is as to whether or not the Premier should step aside.
Thanks for the question, Travis. I would say that certainly after this pandemic is done, there will be time to consider. There will be a reckoning about what was done and what wasn't done in terms of this pandemic. But I am very much focused, and our party is very much focused on how we're going to get people help in real time, how we're going to come together across parties to make sure that that happens. I don't personally think that the best use of our time right now is to seek the resignation of any premier. That's quite a time-consuming thing when we still have people all across Ontario, since we're speaking about Ontario, who should be vaccinated, who have not been vaccinated, the essential workers that still had to go out today without a vaccination in their arm for one reason or another. And so we really, really need to keep our eye on the ball here. This really is not the time for politics to be in the front seat, as I said. The health officials, the health advice, the health experts, they should be in the front seat here. They should be working together across provinces to make sure we're allocating our vaccines and our resources as best as we can. And then, as I said, when the dust settles, there will be time to have whatever reckonings need to be had about the pandemic.
And on the Emergencies Act, Jagmeet Singh has called on the Prime Minister to consider using that in Ontario. What is your take on that? And do you support that?
Well, as I understand it from Mr. Singh's press conference, he has called on the Prime Minister to invoke it, and explained why he thought that was the next step. My answer, even prior to that announcement, and this is what we have been saying for months and months, is that we don't have to go immediately to the most extreme option. There are many incremental steps that we could have taken in order to gauge the interest of people across Canada and provinces in coordinating action across jurisdictions. The Prime Minister and the government should have convened a rapid response task force, an intergovernmental one made up of health officials led by them, to develop a coordinated strategy months ago. It is still not too late to do that. There is clearly a very strong appetite amongst our public health officials and our doctors and nurses, et cetera, across the country, to be there for each other and to support each other. And so my suggestion is that we do that first and see what that yields. And then if other steps are necessary, then we take them. But I still haven't seen that. We should assume that Canadians are generous, that Canadians want to help each other, that Canadians want to be there for each other in an emergency. And then the job of the federal government and the Prime Minister in this case is to facilitate the direction of that goodwill and generosity where it's needed the most.
Thank you,
Thank you for
Travis.
that.
Thank you.
David Thurton, did you have another question, please?
Yes, budgets are about spending. They're also about how you pay for spending. What are your thoughts on that, Madam Paul?
On how we pay for spending?
Yes, how do we pay for the increased spending that this pandemic has required, and the increased spending that the programs that you're proposing that you would like to see in the budget will require?
Well, maybe in two parts. The first is that we will be spending very large sums of money post-pandemic on stimulus. And so the question is, how do we spend that wisely so that we create the economic prosperity of the future so that we can pay that back and so that it doesn't become a burden on future generations? We have said very clearly that prior to the fall economic statement, for instance, that the very best thing that we can be investing our money in are two things. First, a green recovery, because we know that is where all of the big economies in the world are trending. That is one of the greatest economic opportunities of our lifetime. And Canada still has enough time to be a global leader in this extremely competitive, but at the same time, very lucrative field. And so investing in the infrastructure, investing in the projects, investing in the technology that is going to support a green economy and a green recovery is one of the best things we can do to secure our future economic prosperity. And then the second thing is investing in completing our social safety net. We heard from the Parliamentary Budget Officer that a guaranteed livable income was doable, that it would cut poverty by half. And we know how much poverty costs us in terms of lost productivity, in terms of healthcare costs, in terms of housing costs, in terms of the criminal justice system, for instance. So imagine something that could cut poverty by half, even based on a modest model, and at the same time is affordable and doable. We can never forget what it costs us not to invest in social programs. We understood this better in the past, that when we invest in ourselves, we are investing in our future. And so things like childcare, things like post-secondary education, things like guaranteed livable income are exactly the kind of investments that cost us less than our current system and that help us to create the conditions that will allow people to be productive and for Canada to prosper.
Thank you. Do you have a follow-up question, David?
Yeah, yes, I do, but it still doesn't really answer the question. And I understand that these are what you call investments and there's a return on it, but how do you pay for this? How do you pay for that in the meantime? Some people have proposed increased taxation, taxing the wealthiest, making sure that they pay more. I know that is a frequent thing in a Green Party platform, but I haven't heard you speak much about that. So what role does other forms of taxation play in paying for securing this social safety net?
Well, again, it would depend on which program. Certainly in our platform, and when we discuss these policies, we talk about a more equitable taxation system. You're right that we have talked and still do about increasing the tax rate on the wealthiest Canadians. We talk about ensuring that the big tech companies begin to pay their fair share for the privilege of operating in Canada. We talk about closing tax loopholes. But when you look at some of these some of these programs on a case-by-case basis, for instance, guaranteed livable income, that exciting and completely essential social program that is consensus is building around, and one that the Liberal membership, the NDP membership, and our membership have all very recently supported in resolutions. That can be paid for in a great part, for instance, through the savings that accrue by eliminating all of the administrative costs associated with our current piecemeal system, for instance. In the case of post-secondary education as well, we spend hundreds of millions administering the existing program and dealing with the defaults in loans. And so as we go through, we know, as we did with healthcare and our other universal programs, that it is much cheaper ultimately for us to have these universal programs than to have people left out of them, than to have to administer a piecemeal system. So that, combined with some of the measures that I mentioned, make this entirely doable, entirely affordable. And I'll just remind you that in our 2019 platform, it was fully costed and received a passing grade.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. And thank you, David. I don't think there are any other questions, so this will conclude today's press conference. Ceci conclut la conférence de presse d'aujourd'hui. Merci à tout le monde pour venir. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you very much. Merci à tout le monde. Bonne journée.